Mandatory assessments of eligibility for medical transition related care for transgender people is often presented as sort of compromise between trans people and detransitioners who would regret going through medical transition. I argue that this is predicated on a misunderstanding of the effectiveness of assessments, and that assessments can in fact only be a viable compromise position if they are able with reasonable accuracy to distinguish would-be regretful detransitioners from truly trans people, as it's often presented in that work. And what I want to do is argue, well, that they do not. Now, I won't have the time to go through all of the details of the empirical data and the theoretical constructs, but I do want to go through a few of them. Now, something that's used sometimes is standardized tests like GY-DYQ-AA or the Utrecht Gender Dysphoria Scale. And the problem with those is that they are overly binary. They focus on gender dysphoria at the expense of other dimensions of transgender embodiment like gender euphoria and creative transfiguration. They merge all bodily change desires regarding the body part, and they include irrelevant factors like gender expression or feelings about gender stereotypes. Unsurprisingly, recent studies show by Pascalupo and others that around half of trans people feel that the questionnaire don't even accurately reflect their experiences. So the problem we have is that either these and the questions included in those are irrelevant and stereotyping, or they're largely restatements of questions like, are you trans or do you have gender dysphoria? So instead we could just ask those, which is oftentimes already an implied claim of people coming to seek medical transition care, and thus completely useless to ask. Similarly, the DSM-5 diagnosis largely in the same boat, and it's quite unclear how it improves over self-reported gender identity and desire for medical transition, which are already implied in people coming to seek out care. Oftentimes what is asked is gender history in assessments, which are largely grounded in stereotype and often focus on early childhood periods, even though 40% of trans adults began feeling different at or after 11 years old, and 19% of them started feeling different at or after 16 years old. And now we're only talking about feeling different, not at all feeling different in a way that would be cognizable as gender variance or as transgender. So it's no surprise that studies by people like Florence shown that even looking just at occasional regret, recalled childhood femininity was only accounting for around 3.6% of the variance in regret, which is far, 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 far away of what you need for making the useful clinical indicator. Similarly, sexual orientation we now understand as being not something that's very useful as a predictor and has largely been abandoned, although historically has played a huge role in determining who is truly trans from people who aren't. Now, one factor that is often unacknowledged as a use in assessments, even though a lot of trans people reported being used with them, is gender expression. And I've heard many reports of community members reporting being denied hormones, for instance, trans women being denied hormones or being denied a referral letter for not wearing a dress or not wearing feminine enough clothing, which is just pure absurd stereotyping that's not at all grounded in evidence. Then we also have things like regret correlates, which is an attempt at systematizing and finding something that's a little bit more rigorous in terms of assessment, but has really not found any sort of correlate that could that raise to the level that would be necessary for any sort of discriminating. So, even combining the best predictors on certain studies, and in my work I focus a little bit on the work by Florence on occasional regret. Even combining all the best predictors together, we're left with around 85% of patients that don't have any regret whatsoever while still fulfilling those these regret correlates. And it would be completely unethical to delay or deny care to 85% of people for 15% of people who might eventually regret it down the line, especially since studies have shown that time to regret has oftentimes been, 10 years on average. So you can't exactly wait it out either. So even if we adopt this kind of compromise logic, it really doesn't pan out once we follow through on it. And indeed, if it was true that assessments work, we would expect informed consent models to fare worse empirically, which they don't. And again, that's not surprising because the requirement of assessments was not historically based on empirical data. It was based on sort of intuition, one that was psychopathologizing and saw trans as something to be discouraged. So we have studies that show that patients who lied to get care fared just as well as others from a psychological standpoint and achieved the results more quickly. And when we look at studies on informed consent more particularly, even though the base is very limited and there's a lot of limits to those studies, and we do need more research on that, all the data we have suggests that there's really no heightened concern with regret involved with informed consent models. And there's some qualitative indication that perhaps informed consent models actually help remove the regret out of detransition, with people who detransition feeling more free to do so and feeling more comfortable exploring their gender through medical transition, and then realizing that it's not for them and being grateful of having had the opportunity to explore their gender in that way. So since the proposed methods for discriminating between trans individuals and would-be regretful detransitioners proposed by this kind of compromise model, these methods don't work, then we have to really rethink how we approach trans care. And I think that the way forward is really with fostering the therapeutic alliance, truly making space for free and honest gender exploration, including through transition, a view that is incompatible with gatekeeping because it puts people on the defensive and makes them fuss truth and oftentimes lie because they're afraid of not getting the care that they want. Reducing shame towards detransition by making it something that's normalized in the sense of like it's completely okay wherever the path leads you, and really improving support structures for detransitioners. And I'm happy to take questions later, but that's something that I really want to invite people to think about. How do we really improve care for detransitioners in a way that is non-pathologizing?